The forest breathed in silence, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots pressing into the damp earth. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and the distant musk of decaying leaves. The early morning sun filtered through the towering evergreens, casting long golden beams across the moss-covered ground. Somewhere in the distance, the river hummed its ancient melody, a steady pulse beneath the vast wilderness. Ethan Walker moved through the trail with practiced ease, his breath slow and measured. Years ago, when he had first started hiking alone, the silence had felt suffocating. Now, it was the only thing that made sense. Out here, there were no voices demanding answers, no obligations pulling at his every move. Out here, he could disappear, not from the world, but from the weight of everything he had carried inside himself for far too long. Then, it happened. A sound not of the forest. Not the rustling of wind against the trees, not the distant call of a raven. Something raw. A cry. It cut through the morning air like a blade, low and guttural, carrying a weight that made Ethan stop mid-step. His pulse ticked up, his breath suddenly caught in his throat. He turned his head, straining to listen, waiting to see if the sound would come again. It did. A roar, but not one of dominance. Not the sound of a bear marking its territory, not the familiar, deep-chested bellow that warned of trespassers. No, this was something else entirely. This was a plea. A call for help. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His boots dug into the earth as he moved toward the sound, weaving through the thickening trees, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, the whisper of pine needles brushing against his jacket. The roar came again, louder, more desperate. And then, through a break in the trees, he saw it. The river had turned wild. Swollen from the early autumn rains, it churned violently, whitecaps cresting over jagged rocks. The current was merciless, its sheer force evident in the way entire tree limbs were being carried downstream like mere twigs. But that wasn't what made Ethan's stomach lurch. In the middle of it all, a massive grizzly bear was drowning. The sheer size of the beast, normally an apex predator, a king of the wilderness, was rendered powerless against the relentless current. Her powerful legs kicked against the water, fighting to stay afloat, but exhaustion was overtaking her. She was losing. Ethan's breath hitched, his heart slamming against his ribs. Bears didn't drown. They were built for this land, built for survival. And yet, here she was, helpless. But then, his gaze shifted. Across the river, on the far bank, two cubs stood frozen in fear. Their small bodies trembled as they let out sharp, desperate cries, their tiny paws edging closer to the water. They wanted to go after her. Ethan felt his stomach twist. They didn't understand the danger. They didn't see what he saw. If they jumped in, they would die. The mother bear, still thrashing in the water, managed to lift her head. Her eyes locked onto his. Ethan had never seen a bear beg. But in that moment, he could swear that's what she was doing. Help me. Please. His feet moved before the thought had fully formed. He ran. Not away, but toward the fallen tree that stretched across the river like a natural bridge, a precarious, moss-covered structure, slick from the morning dew. It was suicide. The river below roared in warning. The wood groaned beneath his weight. But he didn't stop. Because the moment he hesitated was the moment she would disappear beneath the waves forever. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts as he inched forward. His boots threatened to slip against the damp bark, but his focus was locked ahead, on the desperate creature barely clinging to life below. She was closer now. But she was fading. The cubs across the river screamed. Their cries cut through the chaos, piercing the air with a sorrow that felt too big for such small voices. And then, something inside Ethan broke. This wasn't just about a bear. This was a mother. A mother fighting for her children. A mother who was losing. Ethan lowered himself onto his stomach, reaching his arm out as far as it would go. The current surged beneath him, a relentless, merciless force, but he held steady. She had to see him. She had to understand. Come on, he breathed, voice barely audible over the river's fury. "Come on, damn it." For a split second, the bear's eyes flickered up at him. Wild. Terrified. But then, something changed. Recognition. Trust. With the last of her failing strength, she kicked toward him. Ethan lunged forward, and their hands met. Man and beast. Predator and prey. Flesh and fur. Life and death. His grip locked around her massive, clawed paw, his muscles straining, his body screaming in protest as the full weight of the animal threatened to drag him forward, into the current, into the abyss. But he held on. He would not let go. Not when her cubs were still calling for her. Not when there was still breath in his lungs. Not when she had looked at him like that. The river surged, the tree beneath him groaned, and Ethan pulled, with everything he had left to give. And then, something shifted in the water. Something changed. The bear's body rose. Her massive frame lurched forward, her soaked fur crashing against the bark, and suddenly, she was out. A moment of stillness. The only sound was Ethan's own ragged breathing. He barely registered the way she collapsed onto the earth beside him, gasping for air, her body trembling from the cold and the trauma of near death. But before he could even process what had just happened, before he could even think to move, the bear lifted her head. And then, she did something that would haunt him forever. The river had always been an unforgiving force, but in this moment, it felt almost malevolent. It roared with a fury that consumed everything in its path, thrashing against rocks and uprooted branches like a living beast that refused to surrender its prey. The wind howled through the valley, whipping through the trees with a cruel intensity, as if nature itself was testing the limits of endurance. Ethan Walker remained sprawled on the damp, unsteady tree trunk, his body The river had always been an unforgiving force, but in this moment, it felt almost malevolent. It roared with a fury that consumed everything in its path, thrashing against rocks and uprooted branches like a living beast that refused to surrender its prey. The wind howled through the valley, whipping through the trees with a cruel intensity, as if nature itself was testing the limits of endurance. Ethan Walker remained sprawled on the damp, unsteady tree trunk, his body pressed flat against the rough, moss-covered bark. His arms ached, muscles burning from the effort of pulling the massive bear from the clutches of the river. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering so violently in his ears that, for a moment, he could hear nothing else. But then, the sound that changed everything. A sharp, frantic cry. He turned his head, and his stomach clenched. Across the river, two bear cubs stood at the very edge of the bank, their tiny claws gripping the loose soil beneath them. Their bodies trembled, not just from cold, but from sheer, primal terror. Their mother, their protector, had been swallowed by the river before their eyes, and now, instinct demanded they act. Ethan saw it in the way their small, desperate paws edged closer to the water, and the way their fragile frames rocked forward with every ear-splitting cry. They wanted to save her. They were going to jump in. A surge of panic hit him like a freight train. No. No, no, no. He pushed himself up, his footing dangerously unsteady on the slick tree. His limbs screamed in protest, but he ignored them. His gaze locked onto the cubs, their dark, wide eyes flickering between their mother and the violent current below. One of them shifted its weight forward. Ethan's breath caught. No! His voice cracked against the storming wind, a plea, a command, anything to stop them. The smaller cub hesitated for half a second, ears flicking toward the unfamiliar voice. But the larger one, stronger, braver, or maybe just too young to understand the danger, did not. Its tiny muscles tensed. Its legs coiled. And then, it jumped. Ethan's world narrowed to a single, horrifying moment. The cub's fragile body left the safety of the earth, its limbs flailing as gravity pulled it down. For a heartbeat, it was airborne, suspended in time, before it hit the water with a force that sent a spray of ice-cold mist into the air. The river swallowed it whole. The mother bear, still collapsed on the riverbank beside him, let out a sound Ethan would never forget. A deep, wounded bellow, one of pure, unfiltered agony. It was the sound of a mother watching her child die. And then, as if the pain had willed strength back into her battered body, she moved. Weak. Shaking. But alive. Her massive frame lurched forward, claws digging into the mud, her breath coming in heaving, pained bursts. Ethan barely had time to react before the second cub, the smaller one, the one that had hesitated, prepared to jump. A decision had to be made. Now. Everything that had happened, the bear's fight against the current, the exhaustion in her bones, the way her cubs cried for her from the other side, had all led to this single, impossible moment. If he moved too slow, the second cub would be lost, too. If he left the mother, weakened as she was, she might collapse again. And if he jumped in after the cub, if he got caught in that current. 1,000 possibilities crashed through his mind in an instant. But only one mattered. Ethan's body reacted before his brain could tell him otherwise. With a sharp intake of breath, he vaulted forward, gripping the edge of the tree trunk and swinging down onto the slippery rocks below. He hit the ground hard, his knee buckling beneath him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The cub was in the water, and the river was already dragging it downstream. Ethan stumbled forward, his boots sinking into the mud as he charged toward the bank. The bear was beside him now, barely standing, her massive frame still trembling from exhaustion. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her baby. The cub flailed, tiny paws slapping against the water in frantic, erratic movements. It didn't know how to swim. It didn't know how to survive. And the river didn't care. Ethan had seconds. Maybe less. His muscles screamed as he pushed himself harder, faster. His boots hit the water's edge, the freezing current biting into his legs like knives. His breath turned to ice in his throat, but he forced himself forward. The cub was slipping beneath the surface. One chance. One chance to reach it before it was too late. He lunged, diving forward, arms outstretched, fingertips brushing against wet fur just as the river tried to claim its prize. For a terrifying second, he wasn't sure if he had it. The current pulled hard, nearly yanking it from his grasp. But then, his fingers locked around the scruff of its tiny neck. Got you. The cub coughed, sputtering against the water, its tiny body convulsing in his grip. It was so small in his hands, so fragile, and for a brief, gut-wrenching moment, he thought, too late. But then, a sound, weak, desperate, but there. A whimper. It was alive. Ethan turned, his body half submerged, his breath ragged and burning against his chest. The river fought to drag them both down, but he refused to let go. Not now. The mother bear was still at the edge of the riverbank, her massive head lowered, eyes locked onto him with something beyond comprehension. And for the second time in a single day, Ethan fought against a force far greater than himself. The water clawed at his limbs, but he kicked hard, using every ounce of remaining strength to pull himself back toward the shore. His arms shook, his grip on the cub tightening. And then, a massive shadow loomed over him. The bear. For the briefest of moments, instinct whispered fear. But then, she did something no wild animal should ever do. She leaned forward. Her muzzle brushed against the cub. And with the gentlest movement, she took it from his arms. The warmth of her fur vanished, and the world around him had slowed to a crawl. The roar of the river faded into the background, its relentless surge reduced to a distant hum, as Ethan Walker remained frozen in place, his body half submerged in the freezing water. His breath came in ragged, uneven bursts, his heart still hammering in his chest, but none of it mattered. Not the cold. Not the exhaustion. Only her eyes. The mother bear stood just inches away, her massive frame casting a shadow over him, yet she made no move to retreat. Her drenched fur dripped in steady rivulets, her ribs expanded and contracted with deep, heaving breaths. But it wasn't her size, nor the raw power coiled beneath her thick muscles, that made Ethan's pulse spike. It was the way she looked at him. Not with fear. Not with aggression. But with something that shouldn't be there. Something that no wild animal should ever express. Recognition. The cub in her grasp let out a weak, feeble whimper, pressing itself against the safety of her soaked fur. She nudged it gently, her massive paws adjusting to cradle it close, as if reassuring herself that it was real, that it was still breathing. That it was still hers. And then, slowly, almost cautiously, she turned back to him. Ethan swallowed hard, every survival instinct screaming at him to move. To get up, to back away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and a creature whose mere presence could tear him apart in seconds. But he didn't move. Because deep in his gut, he knew this moment was different. There was no malice in her stare. No wild, unpredictable rage. Only exhaustion. Only relief. Only understanding. And then, she did something no one would ever believe. Her head, massive and regal, dipped just slightly. Not a bow of submission. Not an act of subjugation. A gesture of acknowledgement. Ethan's chest tightened. The air between them was thick, humming with something unseen, something neither man nor beast could explain, yet both could feel. She knew. She knew what he had done. She knew he had saved her child. And now, she was thanking him. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the echoes of what had just transpired into the endless and different wilderness. Ethan had spent years out here, traversing the deepest, most unforgiving corners of nature, convinced that the wild operated on instinct alone, that survival was the only language spoken in these forests. But this moment, this impossible, unexplainable moment, shattered every rule he had ever believed in. His breath hitched as the mother bear exhaled, a slow, rumbling sound, and turned away. Her massive paws sank into the mud, her body still weakened, but she carried herself with a dignity that defied her exhaustion. And then, the cubs moved. The second cub, the one that had nearly jumped to its death, let out a soft, trembling cry and stumbled forward. Its little paws wobbled over the loose dirt, barely able to carry its own weight. And in that moment, Ethan's stomach twisted. It was too weak. Its tiny body trembled violently, its breath uneven, its movements sluggish. The freezing water had done its damage. It wouldn't make it far. Ethan knew that look. He had seen it before. In the faces of those who had been pulled from burning wreckage too late. In the gasps of those whose lungs had held smoke for too long. It was a fight already lost. The mother bear turned, sensing it too. Her muzzle nudged the cub gently, urging it forward. But its body refused to obey. Its tiny limbs buckled, its breathing rapid and shallow. And Ethan felt helpless. The bear let out a soft, mournful sound, one that made something inside Ethan's chest fracture. It was a sound no mother should ever have to make. A sound of acceptance. No. No, not after everything. Not after it had fought so hard to live. His body moved before his mind did. Without thinking, without hesitation, he reached out. The mother bear's head snapped up. The second cub flinched. But Ethan didn't stop. His hands moved gently, carefully. He wasn't thinking about the danger anymore. Wasn't thinking about how close he was to a wild animal whose instincts could turn at any moment. He was only thinking of the cub. His fingers brushed against its soaked fur. It was so cold. So fragile. So close to death. A tremor rippled through the mother bear's body, but she did not move. She just watched. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands working with the same precision that had once pulled people from burning buildings. He knew how to handle fragile life. And that's exactly what he did now. With slow, deliberate movements, he pressed his hands over the cub's tiny ribs, feeling the weak rise and fall of its struggling breath. He shifted it slightly, tilting its head just enough to clear its airway. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. The mother bear inched forward, a deep, guttural noise vibrating in her chest. Ethan could feel her panic, could feel the primal desperation clawing at her instincts. And then, the cub coughed. A small, wet, gasping sound. Its tiny body convulsed, trembling violently as its lungs fought against the cold that had seeped into its bones. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The mother bear, watching every movement, let out a deep, slow exhale. And then, she did something even more impossible. She stepped forward. Not with aggression. Not with fear. But with purpose. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself onto her haunches beside him. Her breath fanned across his arms, warm despite the bitter cold. And then, gently, so gently, she leaned down and touched her nose to the cub's fur. A shudder passed through its tiny body. Its breathing steadied, still weak but present. Ethan felt it, too. The shift. The understanding. He had done something no human should ever do. And she had let him. He swallowed hard, his chest tight, as the mother bear gently gathered the cub, its fragile body pressing against her warmth. For a moment, she lingered. Her head turned, her gaze locking onto his one last time. And then, she made her decision. With slow, deliberate steps, she gathered both of her young and began to move, their trembling frames pressed against her sides. Ethan watched her go, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. But as the last echoes of their steps faded into the thick wilderness, he knew one thing for certain. He had just witnessed something the world would never believe. And something inside him told him. This was far from over. The forest had never felt so quiet. Not the gentle hush of nature's usual rhythm, but an unnatural silence, the kind that follows something monumental, something unspoken, yet profoundly understood. Ethan Walker stood motionless at the river's edge, his hands still trembling from the weight of what had just happened. His pulse, still erratic, thrummed in his ears, and his breath came in slow, uneven gasps, as if his body was trying to catch up with his mind. The mother bear and her cubs were gone now, swallowed by the thickening woods, their tracks already being softened by the damp earth. But the moment lingered, burned into the marrow of his bones, into the deepest recesses of his thoughts. Because what had just happened shouldn't have been possible. His fingers curled slightly, his skin still carrying the ghost of the fragile, trembling life he had held. A wild cub. A creature that should have feared him, should have fought him, should have rejected him. And yet, it had let him help. And its mother had let him live. Ethan exhaled, long and slow, forcing air into lungs that felt too tight. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy, invisible force, the reality of what he had done. Because it hadn't been an act of logic. It hadn't been calculated. There had been no time to weigh the risks, no moment to stop and consider whether this was a good idea or a death wish. He had simply moved. Because in that moment, when the cub was drowning, when the mother bear was collapsing, when the world had shrunk to nothing but those frantic, desperate eyes, he hadn't seen a wild animal. He had seen a mother. A mother who had fought with everything she had. A mother who had been losing. And he had refused to let her lose. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts that refused to settle. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be here, standing on this riverbank, soaked to the bone, staring into the wilderness as if expecting her to reappear. He had come out here for silence. For escape. For the comfort of solitude, of knowing that the world's noise couldn't reach him this far into the wild. But now, he wasn't alone anymore. Not really. He could still feel it, the connection, the weight of her gaze, the depth of something so primal, so ancient, that it defied all logic. And he wasn't sure what to do with that. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine. The river, still relentless, still wild, continued its journey downstream, as if unaware that it had nearly swallowed something that mattered. Ethan ran a hand down his face, his skin cold, his limbs aching from exertion. He needed to move. Needed to shake this feeling, needed to let it go before it took root inside him, before it became something he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. But before he could take a step, before he could turn and leave this moment behind, something shifted. A sound. Distant. Faint. But unmistakable. Ethan's entire body tensed. Because it wasn't just any sound. It was her. Somewhere, not far from where he stood, the mother bear was calling out. Her voice, deep and reverberating, cut through the silence like a blade, raw and unguarded. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't a warning. It was something else. Something that made the hairs on Ethan's arms rise. He turned his head toward the sound, his heart already hammering again. She was still here. She hadn't gone far. And neither had he. Ethan swallowed hard, his feet rooted to the damp soil, the wind biting against his damp clothes. Because something inside him told him. This wasn't over. The forest had changed. Ethan Walker felt it before he even realized what it was. The air had thickened, heavy with something he couldn't quite name. The familiar rustling of leaves, the gentle swaying of the evergreens, the distant murmuring of the river, everything had dimmed, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He stood still, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, the scent of pine and damp moss clinging to his skin. His body still ached, muscles tight from exhaustion, but none of it mattered. His mind was locked on one thing. She was still here. The mother bear. Somewhere, hidden within the thick labyrinth of trees, she was watching. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath curling into the crisp autumn air. The rational part of his mind screamed for him to leave, to turn back, to put as much distance as possible between himself and a creature that could end him in seconds. But the part of him that had just pulled a drowning bear from the river, the part of him that had felt something indescribable when she had looked at him with something beyond instinct, beyond fear, beyond anything he had ever seen in an animal's eyes, that part couldn't move. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't over. A branch cracked in the distance. Ethan's breath hitched. Slow. Heavy. Purposeful. The sound of something big. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. His pulse thundered beneath his skin. And then, she emerged. The first thing he saw was her eyes. Dark. Piercing. Alive. Not the eyes of a beast. Not the vacant, untamed gaze of something that survived solely by instinct. She knew. She knew who he was. She stepped forward, her massive paws pressing into the damp ground with deliberate care. The cubs, small and trembling, followed close behind, their tiny bodies pressed against the safety of their mother's fur. Ethan felt his chest tighten. She looked different. Not the same formidable creature that had fought against the river's wrath, not the fierce mother who had bellowed her grief when her cub was drowning. She looked worn. Exhausted. He had seen that look before. In the mirror. In the faces of those who had come too close to the edge. And yet, despite the weariness clinging to her every movement, despite the tremble in her limbs and the labored rise and fall of her breath, she had come back. For him. The realization settled deep in his gut, heavy and unshakable. She had made a choice. A choice that defied everything he had ever known about the wild. A choice that should not have existed. And yet, here she was. A predator standing before a man, not in hunger, not in challenge, but in something else entirely. Ethan's throat tightened. She was still watching him. Still waiting. But for what? The question coiled in his mind, tangled with the pounding of his heart. Then, something unexpected happened. She moved closer. Not with aggression. Not with warning. With deliberation. Ethan barely breathed as she took another step forward, the weight of her presence pressing against the very air between them. His body screamed at him to back away. To run. But something deeper, something instinctual, held him in place. Because she wasn't threatening him. She was testing him. Another step. The cubs let out tiny, nervous sounds, their paws shifting uneasily against the forest floor. And then. She stopped. The space between them vanished. Ethan could feel the warmth radiating from her massive frame, could hear the steady, controlled rhythm of her breath. And still, she waited. Ethan swallowed hard, his hands flexing at his sides. He had never been this close to a bear before. Not like this. Not where he could feel the weight of her presence, the gravity of the moment. And then, she did something that would haunt him forever. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her head. Not in submission. Not in defeat. In recognition. Ethan's breath caught. Because he knew, without a single doubt, what this was. He had seen it before, in 1,000 different ways. A nod from a firefighter after pulling someone from the wreckage. A silent handshake between two men who had seen too much. The look in someone's eyes when words failed them, but gratitude spoke louder than sound ever could. And now, from a bear. Ethan felt his chest tighten, something raw and unexplainable pressing against his ribs. She understood. And she wanted him to understand, too. The moment stretched, fragile and unbreakable all at once. Then, just as slowly as she had approached, she turned. Her massive body shifted, her powerful muscles rippling beneath her soaked fur. The cubs hesitated for a moment, casting one last glance at the strange man who had done the impossible, before scrambling to follow her. Ethan watched them go, his body rooted to the earth, his mind reeling from the weight of it all. And yet, he knew. This wasn't the last time he would see her. Because the wild had a way of remembering. And so did she. The air had changed. Ethan felt it before he saw it, a shift in the atmosphere, a pressure deep in his gut that warned him something wasn't right. The forest, once alive with the quiet hum of rustling leaves and distant birdsong, had fallen unnaturally silent. The kind of silence that didn't happen by accident. The kind of silence that meant something else was listening. He inhaled slowly, steadying his breath, his fingers flexing at his sides as he scanned the trees. His body was still worn from the river, his muscles ached from exhaustion, but a deeper instinct had taken over now. The kind that didn't care how tired he was. Because something was out there. And it wasn't alone. His eyes flicked to the tracks in the damp earth. The mother bear's heavy paw prints, deep and deliberate, were leading away into the denser part of the woods. The cub's smaller imprints followed close behind, unsteady but determined. They had made it. They had survived. But now, they weren't the only ones moving in the dark. A low, chilling sound rippled through the trees, a deep, guttural growl that barely rose above a whisper, yet carried enough weight to send a shiver down Ethan's spine. His chest tightened. Wolves! He turned slowly, scanning the undergrowth, his breath coming in slow, measured pulls. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, but his hands remained steady, his body trained for moments like this, moments where fear was useless, where the only thing that mattered was what came next. Another growl. Closer this time. His pulse ticked higher. Then, movement. A shadow slithered between the trees, sleek and low to the ground, golden eyes flashing in the dimming light. Then another. And another. The pack was gathering. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind racing through the possibilities. This wasn't random. They were hunting. And he knew exactly what their prey was. His stomach twisted as realization hit him like a fist to the gut. They had been watching. Tracking the mother and her cubs. Waiting. Waiting for the right moment. And now, it had come. Ethan turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto the direction where the bear had disappeared. She didn't know. She had been too weak, too focused on getting her cubs to safety. She hadn't sensed the predators lingering in the shadows, hadn't noticed the patient, methodical way they had been stalking her. But he had. And if he knew one thing about wolves, it was that they were relentless. They weren't going to stop. Not until they had her. Or her cubs. The thought sent something cold curling into his chest. They were too small. Too weak. If the wolves got close enough, they wouldn't stand a chance. Ethan's hands clenched. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to let nature take its course, to remember that this wasn't his fight. But deep down, he already knew. He wasn't walking away. He couldn't. His legs moved before the thought had fully formed, his boots pressing hard into the earth as he took off in the direction the mother bear had gone. The world blurred around him, trees whipping past as his body fought against its own exhaustion. His lungs burned, his breath came in sharp bursts, but he pushed forward. Because he could still hear them. The wolves. Closing in. His mind raced through the scenarios, calculating the odds. They were fast. Faster than him, faster than the bear, faster than anything that wasn't built for the hunt. But Ethan had something they didn't. A choice. He could choose to fight back. He just had to reach her before they did. His boots hit a patch of damp moss, nearly sending him sprawling, but he caught himself, forcing his body forward. The forest thickened around him, the trees stretching higher, the underbrush closing in, and then, through the gaps, he saw her. The mother bear was barely 100 yards ahead, moving slowly, her body still trembling from the river's toll. The cubs struggled beside her, their small legs stumbling over the uneven terrain. They had no idea. They didn't hear the wolves the way he did. They didn't know what was coming. Ethan's throat tightened. There wasn't time. He had to act now. Then, the forest exploded. A snarl tore through the silence, followed by the rapid pounding of paws against earth. The wolves had moved. Ethan barely had a second to react before the first shadow lunged from the trees, aiming straight for the cubs. His body moved on instinct. His hand flew to his belt, gripping the flare he had stashed there. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With a snap, he ignited it. A blast of red light cut through the darkness, the fire licking against the air, casting long, twisting shadows across the trees. The wolves skidded to a halt, their golden eyes locking onto the sudden burst of flame. For a single, tense moment, everything froze. The mother bear turned sharply, her massive frame snapping upright, her ears flicking forward, her body going rigid as she took in the scene. The pack hesitated. But only for a second. Ethan knew wolves. Fire might startle them, but it wouldn't stop them. Not if they were hungry enough. Not if they had already decided this was their kill. His grip tightened on the flare, the red glow flickering wildly against his skin. He had to be smart. Because there were two choices now. Run. Or fight. And as the first wolf took another step forward, its lips curling back, its muscles coiling for another strike. Ethan already knew his answer. Because the cubs were too small. Because the mother bear was too weak. Because, for whatever reason, they had trusted him. And now, it was his turn to protect them. The fire flickered wildly in Ethan's trembling grip, casting erratic shadows across the forest floor. The wolves, a dark blur of sinew and hunger, stood at the edge of the light, their golden eyes locked onto him, watching, calculating. Their bodies, sleek and powerful, tensed in anticipation, as if they were testing the distance, testing him. He could hear the deep, guttural breaths of the pack leader, standing a step ahead of the others. The wolf's lips peeled back just slightly, revealing sharp canines glistening in the dim glow. Ethan swallowed hard. The mother bear was just behind him now, her massive frame looming, her breathing labored from exhaustion. The cubs, trembling, pressed into her legs, making small, desperate whimpering sounds. They were too young to understand the gravity of this moment, too innocent to realize how close they were to death. And Ethan? He had never felt smaller in his entire life. The weight of everything crushed down on him at once, his exhaustion, his fear, the impossible responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He had started this day as just another man seeking solitude. Now, he was the only thing standing between a mother and her children and the end of their lives. His grip on the flare tightened. The flames danced in the reflection of the wolves' eyes, but they did not move. Not yet. They were waiting for something. An opening. A mistake. A moment of weakness. And Ethan was dangerously close to giving them one. The fire in his hand was already beginning to wane, the bright red glow shrinking, the flames curling lower as the last of the chemical reaction burned away. He felt his stomach tighten. If it died before he figured out what to do, they were dead. All of them. The mother bear let out a low, warning growl, shifting slightly beside him. Ethan's breath hitched. No. She was too weak for a fight. She wouldn't last. Not against them. Another wolf took a step forward. Ethan acted. He swung the flare through the air in a sharp arc, sending a shower of embers scattering against the damp ground. The wolves flinched, their bodies jerking backward as the sudden burst of light momentarily disoriented them. It wasn't enough to scare them off, but it was enough to buy him seconds. Seconds he desperately needed. His mind raced. His options were dwindling. The mother bear let out another growl, but it was weaker this time, almost strained. Ethan turned slightly, his eyes flicking to her form, and what he saw sent ice down his spine. She was swaying. Her massive legs, once so powerful, now trembled under her own weight. Her breathing was ragged, uneven. She was barely standing. Ethan's stomach clenched. If she collapsed, if she went down now, this would be over. The wolves knew it too. The leader let out a slow, low growl, taking another careful step forward. Then another. The others followed, slipping through the underbrush, closing the gap. Ethan's heart pounded. Think. Think. His gaze darted to the trees. The terrain. The river. The river. A plan, desperate and reckless, formed in his mind. It was the only option. His fingers clenched tighter around the dwindling flare, his breath shaky but resolute. And then he ran. Straight at the wolves. A snarl ripped through the air as the leader lunged, but Ethan was faster, just barely. He threw the flare, the last embers bursting into a fiery arc. It landed right in front of the pack, the sudden explosion of light and heat forcing them back just long enough. Ethan didn't stop to see what happened next. Because he was already moving. Come on, he shouted, voice hoarse, wild, desperate. The mother bear hesitated. The cubs let out terrified cries. Move, he barked, urging her, demanding her. She took a step. Then another. Then she ran. The cubs scrambled after her, their tiny bodies barely keeping up. Ethan followed, his legs burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the wolves recovered. He could hear them snapping, snarling, their paws slamming against the dirt as they charged after them. They were fast. Faster than him. Faster than the cubs. Faster than everything but fear itself. And then the river came into view. Ethan's stomach clenched. It was a risk. A deadly one. But it was their only chance. The mother bear slowed slightly at the water's edge, hesitating, uncertain. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ran past her and jumped. The world tilted. The wind screamed in his ears. And then, impact. The river swallowed him whole. The cold was instant. Paralyzing. It ripped the breath from his lungs, the current slamming into him with relentless force. But he didn't fight it. Not yet. His eyes snapped open beneath the water, and through the churning chaos, he saw movement above. The bear. For a split second, she locked eyes with him. And then, she jumped, too. Ethan surfaced, gasping, just as her massive body crashed into the water beside him. The cubs, too afraid to be left behind, followed. And then the wolves reached the shore. They skidded to a halt, snarling, pacing, their hunger burning brighter than the fire Ethan had wielded. But they wouldn't follow. They wouldn't take the risk. Not against the river. Ethan, panting, his limbs screaming from the cold, turned toward the mother bear. She was still watching him. Still aware. Still alive. And so were her cubs. The wolves let out one final snarl before vanishing into the trees. And just like that, they had survived. Ethan let out a shuddering breath, his body trembling violently from exhaustion, from the cold, from the sheer, unbearable weight of what had just happened. The mother bear blinked once, slow, deliberate. And in that single look, he understood. She knew. She knew what he had done. Not just today, but from the very beginning. He had chosen to stand with them, to fight for them, to save them. And now, they were even. Ethan exhaled, long and shaky, before turning his gaze back toward the distant shoreline. Because now, there was only one question left. What happens next? The river had been their salvation. But it had also stolen something from them. Ethan Walker emerged from the icy water with a gasp that tore through his chest, his body convulsing from the unforgiving cold. Every nerve screamed, every muscle trembled violently, but there was no time to recover. No time to think. Only time to survive. The mother bear dragged herself onto the riverbank beside him, her soaked fur clinging to her massive frame, every breath coming in heavy, ragged pulls. The cubs, tiny, fragile things, stumbled behind her, their small legs barely able to carry them as they collapsed against her side. Ethan pushed himself forward, his arms barely able to support his weight. His fingers clawed into the damp earth, his breath hitching, his vision swimming. He had nothing left. His body had reached its limit, drained by the relentless cold, the impossible fight, the sheer brutality of nature. But the danger wasn't over. Not yet. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. Ethan's head snapped up. His pulse, already frantic, stuttered. They hadn't left. The wolves. Though the pack had retreated, they hadn't gone far. He could see their shadows moving beyond the trees, their golden eyes flickering like dying embers in the dim, mist-heavy dawn. They were waiting. Watching. Hunting. Ethan's stomach twisted. They had hoped the river would finish the job for them. That the bear and her cubs, and him, would be too weak to fight back, too exhausted to keep running. And now, they were coming to finish what they started. A surge of something raw and furious burned through Ethan's veins. His body was wrecked, his mind frayed, but the primal part of him, the part that had refused to let a drowning bear die, the part that had fought tooth and nail against the inevitable, would not go down now. Not like this. His hands clenched into fists. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He had one chance. One final play. The mother bear struggled to stand, her massive form swaying slightly. She was weak, too weak for another fight. The cubs, shivering and silent, pressed into her, their tiny bodies seeking warmth, seeking comfort. They depended on her. And now, whether he wanted it or not, she depended on him. Ethan forced himself upright, his knees nearly buckling beneath him. His entire body was screaming, the cold digging into his bones like jagged ice, but he stood. And then, without hesitation, he roared. The sound ripped from his throat, raw and desperate, echoing through the forest like a battle cry. The wolves hesitated. Ethan saw it, the slight pause, the brief flicker of doubt in their golden eyes. Good. He stepped forward. The wolves tensed, their muscles coiling like springs. They were deciding. Measuring. Calculating. Ethan's mind raced. He had no weapon. No fire. Nothing but himself. But if there was one thing he had learned in this wild, merciless place, it was this: you do not show weakness. Not here. Not now. He lifted his arms, spread his stance, made himself bigger. He knew it wouldn't fool them for long. But he only needed seconds. Seconds to convince them he wasn't worth the risk. Seconds to make them believe that this wasn't their fight. The lead wolf took a step forward. Ethan didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. The world hung on the edge of a knife. And then, the mother bear rose. Her movement was slow, agonizing, but deliberate. Ethan saw it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way she lifted her head, the way her massive frame loomed behind him. She wasn't just standing. She was rising. And the wolves saw it too. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. The wolves stood at the tree line, their golden eyes flicking between him and the bear, their nostrils flaring, their bodies twitching with hesitation. Then, one by one, they turned. No growls. No fight. Just a decision. A choice. They vanished into the trees, their dark forms swallowed by the mist. Ethan's breath left him in a rush. His entire body sagged, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. He turned, slowly, his breath still shaky. The mother bear was still watching him. Her dark, weary eyes held something he couldn't understand. Something unspoken. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two survivors, two creatures that should have never crossed paths. And yet, here they were. The cubs shifted beside her, their small forms curling into the warmth of her fur. And Ethan, for the first time in his life, felt something shift inside him. Something he couldn't name. The wind howled softly through the trees, the river murmuring in the background. The world was silent once more. But Ethan knew. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Something was still coming. Something neither of them were prepared for. The morning mist clung to the trees, curling like ghostly tendrils between the branches, swallowing the forest in a hushed, silver haze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, heavy with the weight of the storm that had passed. Somewhere in the distance, the river still murmured, its relentless course unchanged by the events that had unfolded along its banks. The world was beginning again. But for Ethan Walker, something had ended. He stood on the edge of the clearing, his body aching, his breath slow and measured as he watched the mother bear. Her massive frame was silhouetted against the dim light of dawn, her fur still damp, her breaths deep and labored. The cubs, nestled against her, moved in small, exhausted shifts, their tiny forms curling into the warmth of her body. They were safe. They had made it. A deep ache unfurled in Ethan's chest, one that had nothing to do with his injuries, nothing to do with the cold that had seeped into his bones. It was something else. Something he didn't know how to name. Because this moment, this impossible, breathtaking moment, should not have existed. And yet, here they were. Ethan took a slow step forward, his boots pressing into the soft earth. The bear's head lifted slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no fear there. No wild panic. Just recognition. She knew him now. Not as a threat. Not as a predator. As something else. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had spent most of his life believing that nature was indifferent, that it did not care for the lives it shaped or the ones it swallowed. That it did not remember. But this changed everything. She remembered. She knew. For a moment, they simply stood there. Two survivors. Two creatures who should have never crossed paths, should have never understood one another. And yet, they did. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves in a slow, rhythmic dance. The cubs stirred, their small limbs stretching before tucking back against their mother's warmth. They would be strong one day. They would learn to navigate this unforgiving world, just as she had. And they would never know how close they had come to losing everything. But she knew. Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. There were no words for this. No way to explain what had happened, what had changed in him. He had come here for solitude. Instead, he had found something far greater. The bear let out a slow, measured breath, her muscles shifting as she adjusted her stance. She was ready to leave now. To go back to the life she had always known. The life that would never include him again. Ethan's chest tightened, an unfamiliar, painful weight pressing against his ribs. This was goodbye. He knew it before she moved. Before she turned, her powerful limbs carrying her forward into the thick embrace of the forest. She walked with purpose, with strength that defied the exhaustion still clinging to her body. The cubs stumbled after her, their small paws sinking into the soft ground, their movements unsure but determined. Ethan watched them go, his feet rooted to the earth, his breath caught somewhere between awe and loss. And then, she stopped. Just at the tree line. She turned her head, her dark eyes finding him one last time. The space between them felt impossibly heavy. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. Ethan froze. Because this wasn't instinct. This wasn't random. This was intentional. A silent acknowledgement. A farewell. His throat tightened, his vision blurred at the edges. He lifted his own head. And in that moment, they understood. A final breath. A final heartbeat. And then, she was gone. The cubs followed without hesitation, their small bodies vanishing into the shadows. The forest swallowed them whole, erasing all traces of their existence, as if they had never been there at all. Ethan remained still long after they had disappeared, his mind struggling to process what his heart had already accepted. Somehow, in the depths of this untamed wilderness, he had become part of something larger than himself. Something ancient. Something unbreakable. Something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The wind whispered through the trees, wrapping around him like a quiet echo. And Ethan Walker, for the first time in a long, long time, was not alone. The forest was quiet now. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear. Not the dreadful stillness that came before something terrible. This was a different kind of quiet. A quiet that felt almost sacred. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath slow, measured, as he stared at the space where the mother bear had disappeared. The trees had swallowed her whole, their dense, shadowed embrace leaving nothing behind, no sign that she had ever been here. But he knew. He could still feel it, the weight of her gaze, the depth of something unspoken that had passed between them in those final moments. And now, she was gone. Ethan exhaled, his shoulders sagging, his body aching in ways he had never felt before. His limbs were stiff, his skin still damp from the river, his muscles screaming from exhaustion. Every part of him felt run out. But deep in his chest, beneath the pain, beneath the weariness, there was something else. Something that settled like a quiet ache. A feeling he couldn't shake. Because this was it. The end. He had done what he could. He had saved them. And now, he had to leave. His gaze drifted downward, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. The earth beneath him was soft, damp, the last remnants of the storm still clinging to the air. There were footprints in the mud, his own, deep and unsteady, mixed with the heavy indentations of paws. The last proof that any of this had happened. But soon, even that would fade. The rain would come again. The wind would smooth the edges. Nature would erase the story, the way it always did. As if none of it had ever mattered. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat thick with something he didn't have a name for. Because it had mattered. Even if the world forgot. Even if the tracks disappeared. Even if no one else ever knew. It mattered. He clenched his jaw, inhaling sharply, forcing his mind to settle. It was time to go. He turned, his boots pressing into the damp ground, his body resisting every step. But he kept moving. He had to. The trees stretched high above him, their branches shifting in the morning breeze. The sun was beginning to break through, golden rays spilling through the canopy, dappling the forest floor with warm, flickering light. It should have felt coming. It didn't. His thoughts were too loud. Each step felt heavier than the last, each breath tighter, as if something inside him was resisting. Like he was leaving something unfinished. Like he was walking away from something he wasn't meant to. Ethan stopped. His fists clenched at his sides. And then, a sound. Soft. Faint. But unmistakable. His breath hitched. It came again, a low, distant chuff. He turned sharply, his heart hammering. The trees blurred around him as his gaze darted back toward the clearing, toward the place he had just left. Nothing. Only shadows. Only silence. For a long, aching moment, he stood there, waiting. Hoping. And then. Movement. His pulse skipped. At the edge of the trees, just barely visible through the shifting mist, she stood. The mother bear. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She had come back. She wasn't alone. The cubs were beside her, their small forms nestled against her legs, their eyes blinking curiously in the dappled light. She hadn't left. She had chosen to stay. Something inside Ethan fractured. He didn't know what it was, didn't understand why his chest felt so tight or why his fingers trembled slightly at his sides. But he knew, without a doubt, what this meant. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't lost. She wasn't lingering out of fear. She was here for him. His throat tightened. He had spent so much of his life believing that the wild was indifferent, that nature followed no rules but its own. That humans and animals were meant to remain separate. But this defied all of it. Because she had a choice. And she chose to look back. Ethan exhaled slowly, his chest aching in ways he couldn't explain. For a moment, just one fragile, fleeting moment, they existed in the same space. Two beings who should have never crossed paths. Two creatures who should have never understood each other. And yet, here they were. His fingers twitched slightly, a quiet, instinctive movement. And then, as if she understood, as if she had been waiting for it, she moved. Not toward him. Not away. Just enough. A final, unspoken acknowledgement. A silent, unbreakable thread. And then she turned. Slow. Purposeful. The cubs followed, their small forms disappearing into the trees. And just like that, she was gone. But Ethan knew. This time, the wild would not erase this. This moment would not fade. Because some things, some bonds, could never be broken.